So I've titled my talk today, The Explainability Turn in Digital Humanities. And what I seek to do, let me just click. What I seek to do is to explore the notion of explainability and offer some idea of what explainability is, what it could be, and how it might be useful to think of in terms of the digital humanities, because I don't think particularly so far the digital humanities have had much of a chance to think about and work with some of the concepts that explainability makes possible. Now, I should just reiterate that my idea here isn't to lay out a technical description of explainability. And in fact, I think, to be honest, that would be not my job to do that. And in fact, it's actually a rather huge area of publication now. There's many publications that have been coming out over the past few years, and they seem to be accelerating as well. And secondly, although I do want to have the tone of a critique, as I say, this is a work in progress, and so I can only really gesture to some of the major things that I think are important to look at, and then I want to try to connect those to the digital humanities and this notion of an explainability turn, if there is indeed an explainability turn, and why the digital humanities might be uniquely positioned to think about this, and how this therefore might be a contributory research program to the kind of work that's already done in the digital humanities. So I've divided it into three. I know time's quite short, so as I often have far too many slides, I apologize in advance if I'm not able to get through them or I have to skip some. But what I want to do really is firstly open up the question of explainability for those who may not know it, or certainly open it up in terms of my interpretation of explainability and some of the things I think that are quite interesting to think about. Then I want to discuss some connections to the digital humanities and why I think the digital humanities might be an interesting site for explainability within a humanistic perspective. That is both how the digital humanities can offer something to explainability, and explainability offers something to the digital humanities. And then finally, I want to wrap up really with thinking about some of the broader contours, the sort of broader research questions even that could be brought to bear through the digital humanities on explainability and the kind of field of study around explainability. So just to contextualize this, I mean, generally my work, I'm interested in the ways in which digital technologies are creating a sort of a living space, as it were, an environment in which we're all subsisting today, and the way in which actually the digital becomes more and more part of our everyday lives, our political lives, our social and cultural lives. And I suppose this is even more intensified when we, observe the way in which we're having to live today via Zoom and all the many other platforms for digital communication that we're relying on. And the mere fact that I can give this talk to you at MIT in this style is quite remarkable, actually, because just 2 or 3 years ago, these platforms didn't exist. And the capacities didn't exist in terms of networks, etc. It was much more piecemeal. So thinking about these questions, it has really a new intensiveness, I think, raised by our contemporary situation. And so they're, I think, very timely questions generally. And also, I just want to kind of signpost that one of the things that really interests me about explainability and the problematics of explainability is the potential for thinking about how questions of explanation might be connected to a broader question of social and political rights and social political movements, actually. Maybe that's something we can talk about in the questions. Now, for me, what's fascinating about explainability is its historical situation, its situatedness, and the fact that a particular constellation has had to come together in terms of concepts and ideas that makes explainability make sense as an answer to a problematic raised by the complexity of digital technology. It's almost a term that we have been searching for in our ways of conceptualizing the difficulties of understanding technologies and trying to think about a way of offering a concept as an approach or a response to that. There have been many attempts to do that. I mean, first and foremost, maybe we might think about media literacy and digital literacy. But explainability is quite interesting in the fact that it's really been developed within the technical fields themselves. It's been developed as a response to certain kinds of problems that those technical areas have identified. And so it contains within it rather an interesting set of, what will we call it, a sort of rather instrumental notion is embedded within the notion of explainability as it generally is deployed. And again, I think that's very fascinating. It'll be something we come back to a little bit later. But more generally, I think explainability is interesting as really a set of theoretical and technical responses to what the technical disciplines have perceived as an explanatory deficit or an explanatory lack. And that, again, we'll come back to in a little while. I just want to sort of signpost that. And of course, you know, to situate this entire context, it has to be placed alongside the wider problematics that have certainly come to the fore very recently in relation to the growth of machine learning and artificial intelligence systems. The problems and the problematics of obscurity in technical systems is not new. Historically, this has occurred again and again and again. The obscurity of technical systems, not necessarily digital ones, is a continual theme. But I do think that these new machine learning systems raise a sort of qualitative difference to the quantitative problem raised by understanding complex infrastructural systems in our societies. And so explainability, again, is very interesting in relation to this. Now, as a response to this kind of new obscurity, if we can call it that, more generally across society, there has been a call for some kind of way of engaging with these systems. So we can think about notions of fairness, of ethics, of bias. And these are very much topics that have been in the news. They're very much topics that have been in very recent publications around the areas of algorithms and software and automation, of course. And these really come to the fore actually in the kind of doomsday policy documents that have been put out in the last sort of 5 years or so around notions of mass unemployment, problems for societies of these new technologies replacing cognitive labor, the idea of automating away the kinds of things that we thought were particularly human, particularly specific to a notion of the human. And so there has been a kind of a very interesting set of discourses really discussing a response to this kind of problematic. I'll just pull out a couple of examples of this. So facial recognition systems is clearly one of the very strong exemplars you see discussed in a variety of different contexts and a variety of different ways, from racialized technologies to political suppression, and also just general notions of a kind of Orwellian surveillance state. And of course, the power of these technologies has dramatically improved over the past decade or so, to the extent to which they are being used almost casually in lots of different contexts of modern life, and often in an unregulated way as well. So that there's a sense that somehow these technology companies are out of control. The other case that often gets brought up is the use of algorithmic judicial systems, particularly in relation to bail decisions. And again, there is a sense of a lack of explanation, I suppose, or justification in relation to these systems. In the US, they tend to be proprietary and there is no access to the underlying decision making. There's no access to the underlying code, as it were, or the calculation that's used. And this has raised real worries that these automated systems are making life or death decisions in many cases, for example, in hospitals, that are essentially without any kind of consequence. So that has been a real issue more generally. So in response, there has been the question of how one can explain or provide some comfort, if we're a little bit more cynical, about the way in which these systems operate, right? And this is this notion of explainability, the idea that things can be explained, and these things can be explained by themselves. And that's an important part of this discussion. And really, explainability is the development of systems that can explain themselves or have the capacity to provide an explanation in some sense. So this notion of explainability is very interesting because it's a term that I think very beautifully captures this interpretative problem. But also, what I find fascinating is the way in which it closes the interpretative problem identified by technical means. And that's very, very fascinating, right? So it's not that systems have to be more interpretable. It's not that they have to be more readable. It's essentially taking as granted that these systems are black boxes. And so instead, the system will tell you why it made the decision it made, right? And that, again, is very, very interesting as a response to this problem. And one of the things that I find very important here is to argue that the idea of a technological response to an interpretability problem is essentially doomed to failure, while explainability is understood through such narrow technical criteria, right? That's a very important aspect of understanding my position on this problem. And so for me, widening and deepening explainability and actually looking, as it were, inside the black box of explainability itself as a concept, unpacking explainability is a key part of my argument through this talk. So let's just spend a little bit of time thinking about explainability. So as I've gestured to already, explainability is the idea that a technical system, particularly an automated decision system, should be able to be explainable and therefore defensible. So in many of the systems we build today and many of the systems that we are now building, actually, they are becoming too complex for our understanding. Very, very difficult systems with multiple decision points, multiple automated workflows, multiple data entry points. And essentially, they become systems of systems and systems of systems of systems with such complex interaction that it becomes very difficult to actually follow the decision-making characteristics of a particular system. Now, this raises real problems then of how one can even approach these systems, because as these systems do become more complex, they also become more capable, and their capabilities start to be incorporated into areas of life that previously would have been undertaken by humans. So making particular kinds of decisions, like, for example, about granting bail or about granting a patient a particular medication or let's say a kidney transplant, right? So as these systems take on these characteristics, then there comes the problem that if we don't understand what these systems are doing, how do we know that they're not containing biases, they're not unfair, they're not unequal? How do we actually challenge these systems, right? How do we get a handle on these systems? And this is very important because the research that is emerging in relation to many of these automated decision systems is that they are indeed biased. They are indeed containing assumptions, normative assumptions of gender, of race, of class. The very simple to understand case of the Amazon CV system that automatically assessed candidates for jobs at Amazon is a really fascinating one of how stupid these systems can be, right, in their simplicity, and yet far-reaching in their effects. So, for example, Amazon creates a system because they get so many applications, it automatically scanned all the existing CVs of current employees to pull out the salient points that it could then apply as the classifier to all new applicants to Amazon. However, the thing that it found as a common denominator for people who are not employed at Amazon is the CV contained the word woman. And that's because most of the people that work at Amazon are in fact men. There's a very, very high percentage of men that work at Amazon. And so if you studied at a women's college, or if you were in a women's netball team, or if you're in a women's football team, or if the word woman appeared anywhere on your CV at all, your CV was immediately cast out. Now, it was only because the system was beta and they were constantly reflecting on the system that at some point it became very apparent that there was this major flaw in this application of machine learning in relation to this system. And we have to remember this is a very simple system. This was one that could be unpicked and that could be run backwards, as it were, to see what it was pulling out as the kind of salient bit of the CV for identifying which candidates could not move forward. In more complex systems that are reliant on much more complex data, so for example, there is the case of a hospital, I think it was in New York, which was using a system that had a multiplicity of data points. It's very, very difficult to work out which aspect of those data are actually affecting the decision making within the system itself. Within that system, I think it was the New York Times that did a wonderful analysis of it. It turned out that the system relied heavily on the ability to pay rather than any particular health element of the data. The pay became somehow prominent in the system. Now, these biases that are built into these systems then become, really, really important to be able to challenge. But one can only challenge them if one is able to analyze them. And if one cannot analyze them, if the system is a black box, if you don't have access to the source code, or if the system is so complex that you just cannot get your head around it, these systems are going to have these biases continue within them. Now, for situations or in a context, shall we say, of an environment where there's an argument that we are living in an information society, and we'll put aside the critiques of that for a moment, or that we are heavily reliant on a digital economy, clearly trusting these systems is absolutely fundamental. And if these systems are seen to contain these kinds of problematics and yet are unchallengeable, then of course there becomes a legitimacy crisis for these systems. In Britain, there has been a huge push to digitize the state. Many of the old interfaces to the state, if we can put it like that, of forms and papers have been abolished, and now you have to rely on user interfaces and web pages. You can see how that also might then feed into legitimacy questions around the state, around government, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a clear onus from both corporations and state to make sure that these systems are not therefore seen as a problem. So how does one address it? Well, one of the ways of addressing it has been a turn towards data and data analysis and questions of data politics and so on and so forth. And this tendency to blame bad data, biased data, or data contamination, and how one can therefore use that to de-bias a system. And this has had, I think, mixed results in many ways. Maybe it's certainly part of the answer, but I don't think it's all of the answer. And it also suggests another reason, I think, why ethics has become so prominent in the debates around these kinds of systems, as if mere application of ethics might prevent these kinds of biases. So, for example, the idea that one would have a corporate ethics standard, or one might have a professional ethics standard of the programmers, and so on and so forth. Of course, there is the problem there of a kind of voluntaristic a way of approaching the answer to these problems, but also one of really abstracting away the difficulties. We might cynically also observe that, the big Silicon Valley corporations really did quite like ethics as a response, because it allowed them to create ethics boards that were essentially unable to do very much at all about, except talk about abstract principles of fairness and not being biased and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I mean, we're in a situation where the solutions suggested are somehow insufficient, perhaps. But explainable systems, I think, are also not just, and this is important in terms of the whole context of the debate about explainability, it's not just about normative outcomes. There are also technical responses. And in fact, in the literature around explainability, I think, to be honest with you, this is often under the surface when people are talking about explainability and biases and inequalities. I think they're also almost more interested in the technical possibilities that explainability offers, perhaps as a side effect of dealing with bias. But I think, you know, the efficiencies that explainability can offer to the development of these systems is kind of interesting in itself. It allows one to question the reliability of a system, optimize a system, check it's working in the correct way, and indeed generally doing what one wants the system to do, right? So that kind of hooking into a system that explainability offers does have this kind of instrumental outcome as well. And so here we are in a situation where we are faced with these very complex systems, and the calls for opening the black box are somewhat perhaps insufficient because they are now so complex. So what are we to do? A good example of this is the recent OpenAI GPT-3 system, which is, well, it's not rumored, as I say, most likely, actually, they state it does have a capacity of over 175 billion machine learning parameters. And you can see, therefore, in this is the kind of scale of complexity that we are encountering, and the difficulty thereby that we have to approach. I haven't mentioned this already, but of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning has lots of implications for the military. And it's not a surprise, therefore, that, for example, DARPA has been very, very interested in pushing explainability as a solution to problems with artificial intelligence and machine learning systems in the military. And again, you can see why trust is important there, and legitimacy, but also these technical concerns about making sure the system does what it's supposed to do. And they really argued that, they didn't just argue, they put quite a lot of money into the development of kickstarting explainable systems and what they called third wave artificial intelligence, right? So systems that somehow are able to know about themselves, perhaps, or certainly are somehow able to, I hesitate to use the term reflexive, but they have a sense of being able to explain themselves. And this is the famous image you've probably seen if you've read anything about explainability. I'll just flash it up for a second in case you haven't. And you can see that the idea is that today we're faced with a situation whereby we are unable to know why a system makes the kinds of decisions it makes, but in an explainable AI system, we're all super happy. The system's told us we can relax, we can sleep well. I would also note, I want you to note what's very, very fascinating here as well is that this system, or this picture, this diagram, also reveals something very, very fascinating about explainability research, and that is that it isn't always about the system knowing itself. Sometimes it's about the black box system having another black box system that is able to offer an explanation of what the black box is doing. So now you have not one black box, but two black boxes, and which is, I think, also very, very interesting, and certainly something that raises all sorts of problematics. One of which I might just foreground, and that is the problematic that in a highly complex system that's very difficult to understand, there's an assumption that any other explanatory black box about that system can only be something like 80 or 90% accurate in its characterization of the other machine learning system. And therefore, you have to accept that any explainability will always fall short of true explainability as such. It's always, in a sense, beneath or fall below a certain ability to explain, right? And that, again, is something that's very fascinating about this whole area. So this is not new, of course, but I've said this before. I'm just going to flash this slide up. I'm not going to read it. But what is fascinating about this is that Marvin Minsky was already saying in 1967 that systems of systems, complex software artifacts, as it were, are already developing beyond the capacity of the programmer. there are already people leave projects, people join projects, people have very bad programming techniques, data is not cleaned properly. There's all sorts of complexities that go into these systems, and they're very, very difficult to trace and very, very, very difficult to understand. Now we're faced with the addition of systems that can, as it were, program themselves, right? So that now the programmer steps away from the learning and classifying process, such that we have this new ambiguity introduced into these systems. So explainability and explanation comes to the fore, I think, even more with the passing of the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, which actually mentions explanation as a kind of legal requirement upon member states. Now, this is a contentious issue because some legal scholars argue that because of the way in which it's incorporated into the GDPR as part of a recital, it technically isn't a strong requirement, but certainly some systems like the British law that's based on the GDPR and the French one have certainly made sure explanation is part of a legal requirement. Now, I'll leave that discussion to the legal scholars. I'm not a legal scholar, and I do think it's quite interesting as to whether explanation can be a legal remedy. But what I want to bring forward is not necessarily the legal right, but really that explainability and explanation in this context produces a normative potential for a social right to explanation. It brings forward a possibility, as it were, for thinking about a way of challenging systems, and also, just to highlight, not individually. We can also challenge these systems as groups, as civil society associations, and even as larger and more complex social groupings. So this is, I think, a very rich area for thinking about what explanation can mean. So here I say that therefore this concept of explainability can be mobilized to challenge these systems. It gives us, as it were, a language to start to question and to push back on these systems, and to some extent to rely on the law to do that. And so generally speaking, then this notion of explainability as it's being developed here, it really helps us develop a way of asking the why question, right? Why is the system doing what it does? Why is that decision being made? And what is a good response to a request for an explanation, right? Which itself is such a rich kind of question, I think, actually, and something that in some of the discussions in computer science, machine learning is often gestured away without thinking about the complexities of thinking about interpretation and hermeneutics and so on and so forth. I think are really, suddenly come to the fore when one thinks about questions raised by explanation. So I'm going to leave you with the series of questions here before I move on to the bit about DH. But what is a good answer to the why question? It's extremely complex. Who is the explanation for? Is super fascinating. What is the theory of the subject that's being used in these explanatory accounts? What's the theory of the subject that's being used in the explanation and explainability, right? It's very little under theorized. And I think that it's going to be very interesting digging into this kind of question to find out, what are the capacities of the subject of an explanatory response? For example, what level of competence, what language, how technical, how metaphorical is very, very interesting. How much detail, right? What's the scope of an explanation? I mean, this is so fascinating. Additionally, we might ask questions about how long does the explanation take? Was it interrupted? Who gave it? When? Where? What are the exact wordings, and why are those exact wordings used, and for whose benefit? Who created the explanation? Is it complicated? A media question, what's the medium of communication that's being used for the explanation? And also fundamentally a question of human interest, who owns it, right? How can one challenge the ownership of the system that provides the explainability? And what I mean by that is that in some cases, third-party corporations are now offering the explainability part of the explanation for your complex black box system. So you get an ecology around explainability as well. In fact, it's one of the big growth areas in tech at the moment. If you can imagine, ethics and tech as kind of the bubbles burst a little bit, in Silicon Valley. Explainability is the current expanding bubble in terms of VC capital, etc. I'm not going to go through this slide. I'm just highlighting there's been a number of discussions about this in policy. So policy areas as well have also been raising the question of explainability. So it's very much rising up the political agenda in Europe, and I would suggest it's probably rising up in the US as well, but I'm less familiar with the debates that are taking place. So what does this mean for digital humanities? Well, it's great that I'm actually here talking to and in the DH program. So I don't need to get worried about what is DH and why it is important. We can move straight on. But what I do want to highlight is a few ways in which I think DH can connect and perhaps help us thinking about explainability. So firstly, I would say that what I think is really fascinating about DH is its way of moving between the practice and theory domains in rather adept ways, and very laudable ways as well. And it's very adept, I think, now of building systems and having conversations about building systems, which requires a very high degree of interpretative competence, both to build them and to bring, for example, a team of multidisciplinary scholars together into a project. And I think that is, well, that's the kind of thing that I think in terms of explainability is absolutely core and missing from many of the technical accounts. Secondly, I think digital humanities has been, again, very laudable in its desire to engage with publics in humanistic styles of thought and communicating issues around the humanities, and particularly this notion of public humanities. And again, if we think about explainability in its wider sense of talking to a public, here I think the digital humanities could offer us some very helpful and interesting ways of engaging and actually furthering the notions of explainability. Now, lastly, I think the other thing that's very fascinating to me, and this is really what I tend to write about in relation to the digital humanities, I think that as the digital humanities matures as a discipline, it has had to engage with a kind of internal criticism over its initial tendency towards instrumentalism, towards its approach to tools and archives and the solutions that it provides for other disciplinary areas. And I think this has been absolutely fantastic for the digital humanities, because it widens out and helps strengthen notions of reflexivity in the discipline, and also encouraging the digital humanities to engage with social and political ideas more generally, right? And therefore, again, strengthening the way in which it could very helpfully think about explainability in the wider context that explainability raises. So those different things, I think, kind of line up really rather interestingly and uniquely, actually, in relation to explainability. Explainability tends to bring together diverse people. It brings together people from across disciplines, across not just the humanities, but social scientists and the sciences. And as anybody who's been involved in any kind of digital humanities project will know, these kind of communicating across boundaries are extremely difficult, right? Merely talking to computer scientists who may have similar names for concepts, but they can mean very different things, is extremely challenging. And digital humanists are very adept, I think, at crossing these boundaries and explaining, right? Actually personifying explanation. And so explainability then can be something that digital humanities could bring into the discipline as a way of talking about the kinds of work it does, almost as a kind of method that it can enrich and offer us as a way of developing the kinds of activities it undertakes. So that's one aspect in way in which I think the explainability can be pulled into the digital humanities. But I think also that the digital humanities offer a humanistic perspective on some of the questions that explainability offers. That is that explainability tends towards causality and causal explanation as a mode of description, shall we say. And the humanities, of course, can offer a more interpretative, a more nuanced, a more hermeneutic way of thinking about some of the kind of questions that explainability offers. And again, widening and deepening the kinds of ways in which explainability might be offered. So, for example, I think the use of metaphors, which is a kind of nascent area in explainability. I mean, there are so many interesting questions about the kind of metaphors that are gestured towards, but also the representative images that are used, the visualizations, the choice about what kind of visualizations and how those visualizations are composed are the kinds of things that the humanists are very adept at thinking about. So explanation itself can become a target of discussion, a target of interrogation, which I think would be extremely helpful. I've talked about the growing public visibility of the humanities, so I don't want to talk about that anymore. So I think I'll move on. I'm just very aware of time, and I want to make sure that I have time left for questions. So I'll move to the last series of slides. So these really about connecting the dots, as it were. So why would we do this? Well, I think one of the things, and anyone who's familiar with my work will know this argument, but really it's the possibility of thinking computation differently. I think that's one of the things that I find very exciting about the potentialities of explainability and bringing explainability into the digital humanities, right? Explainability, I think, deployed as a critical concept rather than a technical response, really is very, very rich and offers a way of us to think about computational infrastructures differently, right? I think this is really, really fascinating. Now, this means to me that digital humanists can open up a critical space within their fields for really developing a critical approach to computation, to the digital, to software, to code, and so on and so forth, through this, let's call it a research program around explainability. It really kind of almost suggests a space of research where previously it may have been more nascent and less defined. And so I think that generally speaking, the digital humanists have this unique expertise that they can offer in terms of thinking about explainability, contributing to the debate actually around explainability, both in policy and also in machine learning itself, which I think would be deeply enriched by more communication with the kinds of expertise that digital humanities has. So I've got a few contexts here. I'm just going to step through these very quickly. Ways in which we might think about this. This is not meant to be exhaustive, of course, but explainability and justification. I think there's a really rich seam of thought to be explored here in relation to the way in which justificatory discourses are connected to explanation, connected to explainability. Here I'm thinking particularly of Boltanski and Thievener's work on theorizing justification and connecting this up. Secondly, explainability and control, really helping an understanding of control mechanisms within technology, how they operate, where they operate, structures of power, for example, structures around decisions and the limits and dangers of relying on automated systems. Explainability and design, so how explainability allows better systems to be built, right? It allows us to understand and therefore critique systems. And lastly, explainability and creativity. So perhaps more speculatively, explainability with this diagnostic capability, which is something that does excite the technical disciplines for improving technically their systems, could also provide digital humanists with alternative paths of thinking about the kind of work they do, which could be, for example, by interrogating through explainable methods the way that a system has classified certain kinds of cultural objects. There may be some very, and I think there probably are, innovative or original classificatory moments going on there, but we might not know because the systems are so complex, we don't really understand what's going on under the hood. And that may itself open up possibilities for other kinds of speculative research in cultural research more generally. So I think that explainability then is a very rich notion. It's a very potentially exciting concept that we could bring over into the digital humanities. And I think that the idea of explainability really connects well to the core for reflexivity in the design of systems, such that if we as digital humanists built these notions of explainability into our systems, we could produce exemplars of explainability. I mean, it seems to me that a kind of desire for a public humanities requires us to produce systems that are understandable and explainable in some sense. And of course, that's something, what that means in terms of a disciplinary outcome, that's something that would be open to debate. But certainly I think that it seems something very humanistic that we would want to produce systems that would have this kind of normative value embedded within them. Also, more generally, in thinking about explainability as a kind of problematic, I think the digital humanities would be a great place for thinking about, you know, why explainability comes now. What is it about explainability that it should emerge at this historical juncture? I think that's very fascinating for digital humanists to think reflexively about that and why it is so important. And lastly, to feed really the ideas that we could develop. One of the big issues in digital humanities has been this kind of sense of almost, I hesitate to say it, but a kind of service sensibility towards other disciplinary areas. And I think that it's very important that digital humanities in and of themselves develop research questions that contribute back out as well as borrowing from others to kind of do the kinds of work that we have done. And here I think we could do some really good work in thinking about explainability that would feed into the cutting edge of machine learning and computer science and other areas that again our expertise would enable. So I think that's my last slide. So that's it, really, laying out this potentiality and possibility for a program. And thank you very much.